Welcome to episode 237 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Miles Davis's little-known and under-commented-on album from 1959, Kind of Blue. What I've got here, this of course came out in Colombia. I've got a Japanese pressing from 1972, a stereo reissue, which is pretty good, but I'm not super happy. So if you have ideas about a really great pressing of this record, then please do leave your comments below. In terms of what to expect, well, this is one of the records, of course, which is routinely touted as amongst the greatest jazz records ever released. I'm not here to offer you some kind of BS hipster take on this. I think this is a really, really great record, and for the most part, it deserves the acclaim it gets. First of all, it takes a kind of cerebral idea about how jazz could change, a kind of musicological idea almost, and makes it real and turns it into some really great music, and that is not a simple thing to do. Secondly, you have, by my count, of the 6 or 7 people playing on here, at least 4 of the greatest jazz musicians and the most innovative jazz musicians ever to take the stage in Miles Davis, Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane, and Bill Evans. The third reason why this is so great, and this is not to be dismissed, is that aside from all those kind of superlatives, there are actually some really good tunes on here. It's normally acclaimed as the first modal record, and I'm sure there's some kind of arcane debate as to whether or not it is in fact the first modal record. There are, of course, modal songs which occur on other records prior to this. In its own way, this record kind of calls time in the 1950s. It draws a line after the first 15 years of what we might call truly modern jazz, and it opens the door to the incredible innovations and the rampant trampling on musical tradition which we'd see in jazz in the 1960s and beyond. In this period, in the mid-1950s, Miles is abandoning bebop, which had been the dominant style for the better part of a decade. He's moving towards a more spacious and spare sound. He's very inspired by the piano playing of Ahmad Jamal, the pianist from Chicago. But his compositions for the moment are still very much within the evolving hard bop style, blues-based and based on chord progressions as the underpinning both for the melodies and for improvisation. Miles's early work following the period where he beat his addiction got good critical notices, but he wasn't having the kind of impact commercially and otherwise that he would have liked. This changes in the summer of 1955 when he and a quintet which includes Monk play the Newport Jazz Festival and attract the attention of George Avakian, who was a mover and shaker and producer at Columbia Records. Miles ends up signing for Columbia, which was a bigger deal. They had deeper pockets, but he still owed Prestige 4 records, and more on that in a second. He has to put together a new quintet, and so at the Café Bohemia in October 1956, he debuts this new quintet with Red Garland on piano, Philly Joe Jones on drums, Paul Chambers on bass, and Sonny Rollins on sax. The problem was that Sonny Rollins was trying to kick his own heroin habit, and being in a group with Red Garland, Philly Joe Jones, and Paul Chambers, all of whom were users, was not the right environment. So pretty soon he left and went back to Chicago to get clean. In comes John Coltrane. There's a lot of musical technique development happening within the quintet at this time. Miles, throughout the middle 1950s actually, is experimenting with the use of the harmon mute. Also, this period starts to see the contrast between Miles moving to these very kind of spare, almost whole note or longer bass solos and use of white space and quiet spaces in the music, contrasted with Coltrane's busy, sort of evolving towards a sheets of sound kind of approach where he's squeezing ridiculous technique and even more ridiculous numbers of notes into his solos. In this period as well, Miles is alternating his work in the US with his quintet with his own tours of Europe in 1956 and 57. These periods away afford Miles a lot of context, both on American society, which paled in terms of the way he was treated compared to how he was treated in France, but also the travails of his largely drug-addicted band. And so in the spring of 1957, he decides he's had enough, and he fires John Coltrane and he fires Philly Joe Jones. This famously is the kick in the rear end which Coltrane needs. By the fall of 1957, he's clean, he comes back into the fold, and also into Davis's group, which now becomes a sextet, is the alto player, Julian Cannonball Adderley. It's a bit of a truism to say that Miles is a restless intellect and was always changing, but this is what was happening. And at the time, he had spent a few years in hard bop, but he wasn't particularly satisfied, and there were 2 separate musical tangents that he was exploring. One of these was in working in larger musical settings in a small group. He, of course, famously had led a 9-piece group, the Nonette, in the late 40s in the sessions, which eventually got released as Birth of the Cool. Avakian encourages Miles to get back in touch with Gil Evans, with whom he'd worked on the Birth of the Cool sessions. That leads to a fascinating series of collaborations between those two, which kind of stand outside not only Miles's general body of work, but also kind of outside the jazz mainstream. The second musical tangent that Miles was exploring at this time was modal jazz, which was stripping jazz down to its basic harmonies or modalities and moving away from chord progressions, which had been the typical means of structuring jazz compositions and, for that matter, improvisations. To achieve this, he hired a young, fairly introverted piano player, a guy called Bill Evans, whose background was not in blues and hard bop. His background was actually in classical. Evans was a great piano player, my personal favorite, incredible body of work, but he was also sensitive and not the most robust character. And after several months of playing with Davis, he basically was worn out. He said, "I've got to leave." And so Davis regretfully lets him go. However, Evans had really inspired Miles, particularly in terms of composition. And on the album Milestones, the title track, track 1 on the second side of that record, is the first modal track which Miles ever recorded. And if you want an example, a clear example, demonstration of how modal jazz differs from hard bop, forget all the theoretical explanations and the musicology. With all due respect, because there's a lot of good stuff out there, just listen to that record and listen to how that track differs from all the other tracks in that record. Miles had used Red Garland for that track, but he'd really wanted Evans, who wasn't available. By the spring of 1959, he'd written a whole album's worth of modal tracks, and despite the fact that he brought in Wynton Kelly to replace Bill Evans, he reaches out and gets Evans to come back to play on this record. Kinda Blue is made in Columbia Records Studios on 30th Street in Manhattan on March the 2nd and April 22nd, 1959. The producer might have been George Avakian, but he had left Columbia Records in the last year and had moved out to the West Coast, and by this point was in the process of getting ready to set up Warner Brothers Records. The producer was actually Irving Townsend, who used to be a band leader back in the day. That hadn't worked out, and he'd gotten a job with Columbia Records actually writing ad copy. Eventually, because of his musical background, he persuades Avakian to let him help out on production, and eventually when Avakian leaves, he steps into the producer's chair, so he's the guy on the sliders for this record. Miles is on trumpet, Coltrane's on tenor sax, Cannonball is on alto sax, Bill Evans is on piano, except for Freddie Freeloader, the second track on side 1, where it's Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers is on bass, and Jimmy Cobb is on drums. Lots been said about the music on this record. I'll just talk about the things I find particularly meaningful. The opening, So What? I find that the sense of anticipation that Chambers and Evans and Cobb managed to conjure while we await Miles's entry just is exciting every single time you hear this, no matter how many times you've heard that track. The contrast, too, between Davis and Coltrane. Davis's long, cool lines and Coltrane's busy saxophone work, very, very exciting. And one of the only complaints about this whole record that I have is that Paul Chambers' bass on this is a little bit muddy, I think, at the beginning, which is kind of strange considering how central the bass is in laying down that original pattern, just as central as Jimmy Garrison's is on A Love Supreme. Should have been done better, in my humble opinion. Freddie Freeloader has Wynton Kelly stepping in on piano, and it's a lot bluesier and more cheerful than most of the rest of the album, probably unsurprisingly, given the change in personnel. The final track on side 1 is Blue and Green, and Miles here is on the mute in one of the most Miles on the mute tracks I think that exists in his whole canon. Coltrane offers something a little bit different here, which is nice, and Evans's work is quite contained but very, very beautiful. Side 2 starts with all blues. One of the hallmarks of this record is the number of times that the band is really able to create and then release these periods of creative tension in the music. And here you have this quiet, fluttery piano figure played by Evans, and Miles's long, thin lines on the horn, every now and then relieved by a much more bluesy and familiar rhythm pattern, and then back to that tense feeling again. That dynamism is great. Finally, we have the beautiful Flamenco Sketches, which is a wistful ballad to end all wistful ballads. On this track, too, everybody takes their time in their solo, and no more so than in Evans's solo. Notwithstanding Miles's contribution, Evans's playing throughout this record is vital in what you might call tying the whole room together. This record could be a surprise for people who've heard about it and are expecting some kind of revolution on wax, because its main innovations are not immediately apparent. It's not like Please Please Me or Led Zeppelin 1 or Straight Outta Compton. It's not like the revolution is here and it's in your face, but it's probably pretty close to everything its creator wanted it to be, both a cerebral leap forward, but more importantly, a profoundly satisfying and chilled out piece of truly modern jazz in the fullest sense of the word. It offers something new every time you hear it, and for me, it's a pretty obvious 5-star record.